This court acknowledges, as I suppose, the validity of the law of God. I see a book kissed here which I suppose to be the Bible, or at least the New Testament. That teaches me that all things whatsoever I would that men should do to me, I should do even so to them. It teaches me further to remember them that are in bonds as bound with them. I endeavored to act up to that instruction. I say, I am yet too young to understand that God is any respecter of persons. I believe that to have interfered as I have done, as I have always freely admitted I have done, in behalf of his despised poor was not wrong but right. Now if it is deemed necessary that I should forfeit my life, for the furtherance of the ends of justice, and mingle my blood further with the blood of my children and the blood of millions in this slave country whose rights are disregarded by wicked, cruel, and unjust enactments, I submit. So let it be done. When I was in college, I had a couple friends who were even more into video games than I was, because I wasn't able to own an Xbox until I was 17. And all these fun new games were coming out, like Borderlands 2, Shadow of Mordor, and Bioshock Infinite. And because I was able to try the first two, one of my friends actually gave me his copy of Bioshock Infinite for the Xbox 360. Thanks, Jeff. I really appreciate it. Recently, I had a minor epiphany speaking with a friend of mine about some political issues while I was working on a larger retrospective about another video game series, and I wanted to revisit this game specifically with you all for the purposes of approaching mainly the politics of the narrative, because I think it's actually pretty important to our current cultural moment. Before its time, you might say. And also because upon revisiting the main game, there was a lot going on there, and I wanted to give voice to it in a quick breakdown. So what was a short essay about the politics of a political revolution in Bioshock Infinite became a broader revisitation of the game as a whole. Also, if you enjoy these kinds of videos about finding meaning in video games, you're in a lot of luck, because I have some massive ones planned down the line, if you're all receptive. Let's go. So, for a quick recap, in case you haven't played this game, the player takes the role of Booker DeWitt, a private detective, former Pinkerton and soldier of conflicts such as Wounded Knee, effectively making him too evil to be a protagonist in the Red Dead Redemption games, which is something. He sets out to ascend to Columbia, a mechanical wonder and city in the sky, which has seceded from the United States in this alternative history, and which is founded on the Christian nationalist cult around Zachary Comstock, also called Father Comstock by the faithful. DeWitt thinks he's here to abduct a girl to wipe away his personal debt, but as the story unfolds and we meet Elizabeth, the lamb, and Comstock's unwilling heir, we see that, much to the surprise of everyone, all is not well in Columbia. In fact, even setting aside the core of the narrative around the personal abuse Elizabeth has faced, Columbia plays host to some of the worst qualities in this era of American history, from racial segregation and anti-miscegenation sentiment to starving workers living in company towns and spending their pay at the company store. Besides Father Comstock and Elizabeth, a few other antagonists and protagonists emerge from the narrative. Jeremiah Fink is the robber baron capitalist with whom Booker vies whenever Comstock isn't front and center in the narrative, and others like logic-defying scientists, the Lutece twins, or Black revolutionary Daisy Fitzroy, come into the forefront in certain specific moments to clarify problems or represent certain themes and ideas. Mostly, however, the player spends the game with Elizabeth, and all the threads of Columbia unravel. One by one, the aforementioned characters are all killed, or, in the case of the Lutece twins, are revealed to have been dead all along, flitting between dimensions even as our characters do. The game is saddled with a rich socio-political aesthetic, but is ultimately a very character-driven story with a lot going for it if your main concern is Booker and Elizabeth. There's also a strong science fiction component to the alternative history, which is again centered on the two main characters in a very important way, which involves a deterministic multiverse connecting alternative timelines. The big twist, spoilers ahead, but this is a retrospective after all, is that Booker is not only Elizabeth's real father, but he's also Father Comstock from an alternative reality where he never received his baptism to wash away the sins of Wounded Knee. The game ends as Elizabeth's from multiple alternative realities drown Booker DeWitt in a final baptism, so that he can die before any version of Father Comstock is ever created, thus ending the cycle. As the camera pans upward, all the Elizabeths disappear, save one. The gameplay of Bioshock Infinite is pretty straightforward, and, cards on the table, I'm not a big fan. The Vigor system grants various powers to DeWitt, and in theory these allow him to navigate combat situations or even the world in various ways, but usually they just amount to slightly varied types of attacks on enemies. It's got all the variety of Skyrim magic, and while I'm a known Skyrim enjoyer, I don't mean that strictly as a compliment. The best thing I can say about the Vigors are that they're intuitive and theoretically very creative, but their limited use cases in the game dulls the experience. By contrast, the gunplay of this first-person shooter game is exceedingly bland. You can't carry an insane amount of ammunition for any one gun on your person, though you can carry some for all guns at all times, but you can only carry 2 guns at a time, and not all enemy encounters will give you more of what you need, which means you'll be dropping and abandoning guns you might otherwise want to use often enough. There are still moments that ameliorate this problem, but it's still something the player will feel as the combat wears on. I'm also not in love with how severe the fall-off on certain guns, like the carbine, can counterintuitively become in some encounters, or with how the guns handle. Everything feels too fast to be precise, or too slow to be safe when altering aim settings, so I just gritted my teeth and thought fondly of the Halo games while I made my way through it all. Elizabeth does make things easier. She's smart, funny, emotionally relatable, and very useful in a pinch when you need a healing item, salts, or ammunition. She can also pick locks for you and will point out things about your surroundings. It was a pretty big deal when the game came out that there's a kind of subversion of the story of a princess like Rapunzel, where we're actually kidnapping Elizabeth at first, and it turns out that she's more than capable and ends up becoming our equal partner in the adventure after reasserting herself time and time again. Her AI in this game is pretty marvelous, especially for its time, and although no one wants you to know this, her being in the game actually caused a pretty substantial leap forward in publicly available animation technology, because people really wanted to make porn of her. Like a lot. So much. Try not to think about it too much, but the point is that lots of things progressed in no small part due to how much people liked this character, and for the record, I'd like more games where NPCs are emotive and offer help that you can then accept instead of ordering them around. It gives them a sense of agency, which is ironic, given everything I just said, but is also fundamental to the narrative of the game. Players are able to use the skyhook melee armament to traverse rails in the air, which is neat for exploring different environments but a bit awkward in combat. Unless you overinvest to a ridiculously cautious degree in shields and health, even to the detriment of salts, which are your magic resource and the most creative part of the combat, you'll get knocked down quite easily on normal or harder difficulties. I found it quite odd how punishing the game seems to want to be when you're surrounded by all of this counterintuitive architecture that tempts you into riding along in a manner which, if you're going at a pace where you can shoot enemies, you'll be exposed to some returning fire, when enemies can be bullet sponges who shred your health pool so thoroughly. I think this is the only first-person shooter game where I genuinely turned the difficulty down to easy and had a better time, and I'm not ashamed to admit it. When Bioshock Infinite was being teased, there were all these weird or over-the-top ideas being put forward by the developers, like an open world with overlapping timelines that can be jumped between and explored, and the reality is that Bioshock Infinite as it shipped is actually a pretty linear game where the player is rewarded for exploring in the sense that there might be a good upgrade or treasure down the hall, not on the other side of an open world map. To be clear, that last part isn't a negative criticism from me. I like linear narratives and hate that everybody has, for so many years, seemed to want every video game to be open world. Video games are actually capable of benefiting greatly from tight, focused, linear design, because it means that development time can also be focused on experiencing that design in all its finer points. Which would you say is more of a marvel of video game design, the lush forests of The Elder Scrolls IV Oblivion, or the awe-inspiring cathedrals of Anor Londo in Dark Souls? Both are beautiful, and both were praised endlessly upon their respective games' release. But is it even a contest? Sure, we don't have to choose. Video games as a medium can have both, but why is the preference for openness over narrowness when developers have such a difficult time threading that needle? When reviewers react poorly to that design choice, they tend to call it unfocused or empty. But is an openness without proper direction or deep content not merely an unfocused design masking itself with rhetoric about player choice? To be clear, I love both the games and both the areas that I just used as an example, but I feel the need to advocate for linear level and narrative design. The linearity of Bioshock Infinite works to its advantage, I think, allowing it to tell a particular kind of story. The question then becomes, is that story worth telling? Now may be the time for some alternative perspectives. I'd like to direct you all to Monty Zander's video about this game, which, if you're looking for something longer while waiting on me to finish up some longer essays, should scratch that itch nicely. And while he notes some similar issues with the combat, as I have, I liked how fresh and genuine his take seemed. I watched his video while in the middle of working on mine, because I was worried that I'd be the only one with my perspective, and while I can happily say that here on this channel I do like to deliver a fresh point of view, and by the end I hope you will agree that I have succeeded, I also felt reassured that I was not the only one to at least feel positively about some of the game's narrative, even if there were some major elements to the combat which I didn't enjoy as much. Monty Zander's video also directed my attention to two other critics, one of whom also released a somewhat more recent piece about this game, and I'd like to cite them both here, so thanks, Monty. I was just going to talk vaguely about this game's reception, but you really helped to give me a leg up by reminding me this stuff existed. However, on the very slight and theoretical off chance on which Monty ever sees this video, I just told kind of a fib, and I should make it clear that the article by Stacey Henley which he mentions is named in his description with a link that actually directs to a different article for The Gamer published about a month later by Jade King. This confused me a bit when I was reading through the links in his description, so I thought I'd mention that it could help to edit that description to correct for that. Now I have two articles to look at though, which is neat. In the first article, Stacey Henley describes a prior period of reverence for Bioshock Infinite that she seems to recall quite well. For the life of me, I can't remember a time when Bioshock Infinite received that exact treatment, unless what she means is that it was a part of this vague can games be art debate that seems to be getting referenced. I can recall things like this for the first two Mass Effect games, for Skyrim, for many From Software titles, and a number of others, and to this day the first Bioshock seems to retain that kind of reference in degrees, but as I experienced that history, Bioshock Infinite was a game that people highly anticipated, enjoyed quite a bit when it came out all the way through the release of its DLC, and then mostly appeared to shelve, with left-wingers occasionally making critiques over the years about how the game poorly represents a revolution against white supremacy. I also don't think it's a masterpiece, but I'm not sure I have the same memory as Henley, maybe because for years I spent more time with people who thought poorly of the game than otherwise. She does go on to say, however, that, quote, it also attempts to hold up a mirror to America's racist past, but it does so through a very modern lens. Infinite's attitude towards racism is that some people definitely were racist, but your grandmothers and grandfathers definitely weren't. Still, several scenes involving black characters, particularly the interracial couple being pelted with baseballs, itself a clever representation for Americana, lean in harder than you might expect a video game to, especially a decade ago. However, there are some huge missteps in this. Yes, the scene confronts the racism black people have historically been subjected to in America, but having baseballs thrown at you, while a layered visual metaphor, is tame and cartoonish. Worse, racism is gamified, with Infinite inviting you to join in by tossing a baseball yourself. This might be excusable in a game that was prepared to confront you, the 21st century player, for the remaining systemic racism that the era Infinite depicts helped entrench, but it does not. Racism was bad, but then it went away. For every sharp observation, the black janitor able to eavesdrop because everyone ignores him, there are a dozen times Infinite ducks the issue. Comstock is violently, stereotypically racist, but most of the townsfolk who, given the era and regime they gleefully tolerate, were almost certainly racist too, are treated as quaint and jolly citizens going about their lives. It also martyrs Daisy Fitzroy, black leader of a citizens' uprising, in a weak attempt to play both sides. Henley's piece is, at its outset, smart and incisive, pointing out the commonly felt new media marginalization of video gaming as a medium compared to film and literature, with which Bioshock games and Infinite in particular have a lot in common. I do, however, feel the need to strongly voice some disagreement with her critique. First of all, she just kind of gets the townsfolk wrong, in my opinion. If you take some time with the game, you'll regularly bump into pieces of dialogue like this one I got at the beach. A white founder, being the supremacist racial group from Colombia, states that, quote, people don't know their place anymore, end quote, with one of her compatriots commenting that, quote, an Oriental, unquote, came up to her on the street and asked her for the time, One observes there should be a law, to which the reply is, I think there is. Perhaps Henley just simply did not recall the in-game dialogue quite so well, but this isn't the only time something like this happens, so the idea that Bioshock Infinite wants us all to think that Columbia is an otherwise idyllic place filled with non-racist people simply doesn't ring true to me. In fact, the opposite seems to be the case often enough. On the subject of the gamification of racism with the throwing of the baseball, I really think Henley got that scene all wrong too. Maybe she's since changed her mind, but what we're observing and making ourselves complicit in by the virtue of Booker's participation in that scene is essentially a stoning. That interracial couple is being lynched for public entertainment. The player has the choice to flout the lynching, and of course, before it can take place, Booker does kill the police and scatter the crowd, but what Henley smartly observes in the cleverly placed Americana of the baseball is not merely being juxtaposed, but made mechanically complicit in a state-sanctioned hate crime. The black woman begs for mercy, and the Irish man begs you to stone him instead, because, potentially as his last act, he's protecting her. It's an exceedingly sad and tragic scene, and I don't know if I can countenance dismissing it so easily. That scene is actually saying something really dark and potent about these supposedly more anodyne, non-racist elements of American culture, and I have to give it credit for that. Monty Zander's video also put me onto a 9-year-old video by a critic named Satchel Drakes, and here's how he approached the scene.
Some of my favorite critics stated that Infinite's commentary on racism and consequently classism was shallow and underdeveloped, that Irrational merely flirted with the idea of sociopolitical depth to maintain that Bioshock edge, but failed to take a chance on diving into something substantial. I disagree. Without any spoilers, discovering the checks and balances behind Columbia's glossy veneer, the glimpses into the spoils of social oppression, the toll it would take at large, and the parallel outcomes that spoke nothing short of the fragility of the human condition at work in all parties, all of these were incredibly authentic. These racially charged themes serve the purpose of the meta-narrative at just the right dosage to not lose focus of everything else happening in Columbia. I think we're forgetting just how prevalent the class wars got. It was by no means hard to miss. Would it be better if the narrative took a turn for becoming the color purple and observed a poor black individual's life under fire, or if it singled out the dystopian idealism and became the village drama for the rest of the game? This might be compelling DLC, but Elizabeth and Booker were both uniquely secluded and external characters to Columbia. Elizabeth is Rapunzel, and Booker's from another kingdom. Neither of them are so involved in their current landscape that the cameras would shift gears so abruptly. This is what makes this journey so genuinely exploratory.
I think Satchel hit the nail on the head. I really wanted to bring his voice here as a citation because I think it matters to build our critique of how things like racism are built into the narrative productively, and his video has a ton of that, which makes it a cut above a lot of video game critiques on YouTube. What I will also do in the interest of fairness is aid Henley's point by making a better argument in its favor, I think. An apocalyptic alternative future that Booker sees with a different version of Elizabeth is the entire city of Columbia using its heavy munitions to raze New York to the ground. This visual, along with the alternative history of Columbia's secession, does potentially allow a white or American viewer some deniability, where they would otherwise hold an uncomfortable proximity to Columbia's many faults by showing them a way of seeing Columbia where they are its hypothetical victims, not its collaborators. Of course, I don't know if I think this undercuts Bioshock Infinite's narrative at all, because it's not as if white fascism doesn't destroy white lives, but for what it's worth, it's a wrinkle in time. In the second article, Jade King has this line where she says, Bioshock Infinite, on the other hand, strived to be so much more and fell flat. I cannot fault its ambition, but I can spend all day tearing apart its woeful execution. And isn't that what we tend to do here on YouTube? We all love a good teardown, and we all love to be validated in our ways of thinking. What does Jade King have to say about the execution? Well, for starters, she writes that, quote, it's still a great game, but its ambitious story was so overwrought with pompous ideology and righteous ideas that it fell victim to its own lofty idea of what intelligent narrative exploration is supposed to look like. One of the defining takeaways is that freedom fighters are just as flawed as their racist oppressors, because they also resort to violence in order to further their cause. Not that it matters, because Booker DeWitt is a human army who will march through them in a storm of bullets and hellfire regardless. Violence begets violence, and it doesn't matter if you're fighting for equal rights or for a world where racism isn't a thing. That's a little fucked when you think about it, but gamers like to feel smart, so Bioshock Infinite became a hallmark of narrative brilliance for a time. There's a lot of accusation in the passage, but it's not the end of the article, so it seems we have to do some more quoting before we're satisfied with substantiation. King does point to Daisy Fitzroy and the portrayal of the Vox Populi revolution as a general fault, though, so as with Henley, it's not like she doesn't have anything backing up her reading. She also says, quote, "Learning a bunch of words and themes doesn't make you smart, applying them does, and Bioshock Infinite does so with the grace of a toddler scribbling on the living room wall. Yet it was a necessary milestone for the medium. We needed a game like this to examine where we were as storytellers and to see how far we'd come and how far we still had to go. Pushing the boat out too far is necessary to know how far we can walk out to shore without losing our heads under the water, and I'm pretty sure we can still see Booker's unfortunate little face bubbling beneath the surface." King ends by calling the game a well-meaning work that took risks, whose failures could further the work in the industry's future. And while I think that's a very positive spin, it does feel a little conciliatory to me. Perhaps these writers just didn't want to invite any harassment, which seems to happen anytime a writer criticizes games, or perhaps they were only trying to be provocative without being hurtful. But overall, the words of critics like Henley and King paint Bioshock Infinite as an almost heinously sinister work of fiction on the frontier of counter-revolutionary ideology. They leave enough room so as to not accuse the developers of any intentional reactionary politics, but they do paint a picture of a group of centrist morons huffing their own farts, and I have to say, that is not my experience with Bioshock Infinite upon revisiting the game, despite the fact that if I had heard these words a decade ago, I would have been more amenable to them. I've tried not to be too crass or cruel to Henley or King, despite disagreeing with them, because I want to respect their work and keep in mind the context of this cultural debate, including the fact that their side of the aisle seems to be pretty well critically populated. However, there is something Satchel Drake's included in his 2014 video that I couldn't help adding here as context.
It seems like a particular sect of gamers, a group that at least in part overlaps with the enthusiast press, has approached irrational games with cupped hands and entitlement to a game that will help them justify to themselves and to their peers that games are a deep intellectual medium.
I had to laugh when I saw this. He was so right, to the degree that he called Henley's article 8 years before it was even written. Move over, Comstock, there's a new prophet in town. In all seriousness, I do have to hand it to him for this, although I do tend to think on the scale that Henley does. However, it's important to check ourselves like this every once in a while. Now that I've directed you to some good sources with competing views, I'd like to expand on my own. Monty Zander notes in his video that in the real world, in real space, there's a very earnest marriage of Christian iconography and morality with American law and culture. It's an everyday occurrence here, where legal literature is entwined with biblical scripture. We see that the mythology of Columbia is equally a mythology of America and of Christianity, a marriage of Constitution and Bible. Fascinatingly, the alternative history of Columbia parallels the Confederacy, although it occurs afterwards in the timeline, and it has a similar element of its mythology venerating John Wilkes Booth and demonizing Abraham Lincoln through Comstock's preaching. Some irregular militants wear uniforms reminiscent of the Ku Klux Klan, and Comstock's teachings, along with Jeremiah Fink's propaganda, are fixated on justifying servitude and slavery. Every encounter with the politics of this game is equal parts sacred and profane, with the two elements feeding back into each other and enhancing the portrayal of a sinister version of America. The visual and auditory elements surrounding the Christian iconography, with beautiful lights and pure white worshippers ankle-deep in holy water, giving way to an idyllic garden with marble statues welcoming Booker DeWitt to Columbia, and Lacrimosa by Mozart kicking on when the player enters the shrine to Lady Comstock in the Hall of Heroes, all draw the player into, at minimum, a somber engagement with the sights and sounds of power. And this lends some small potency to the words of Father Comstock as he engages in his hateful and narcissistic preaching. I've said it before, but this is something that some real, actual, hateful Christians in real life will do, spitting fire from verse, like they're calling down heavenly judgment upon you. The only thing Booker's more hostile engagements with the civilians of Columbia were missing was someone coming up to him and speaking in tongues to try to intimidate him, which is a real thing that some Christian extremists will actually do in real life, to intimidate people by attempting to portray a heavenly voice speaking through them incomprehensibly. Like with the other sights and sounds of power, this is the sort of thing that some more hateful Christians will do that carries a special meaning that elevates them over other people, because the implication is that God is touching them and you can't comprehend their words because you're an impure sinner, among other things. If this happened in an optional encounter or was cut content, I wouldn't even blink. It would be so at home in this game. All of this is to say that there's something enduringly compelling about Columbia that, like with my descriptions of it and my explanations of those descriptions, I just can't capture in full here. But as we've seen, some accuse this game of being all aesthetic bark and no critically thinking bite. So let's go ahead and answer the Vox Populi question now. But first, bona fides. Many of you will know me, as I've been making YouTube videos about politics since 2017, but for those who do not, it may interest you to know that I am a communist. I have been what you might call some flavor of socialist or leftist since I was in college, and have been largely left-leaning for my entire life, for as long as I can remember. And for as long as I can remember, I've perceived politics as very important. I was writing letters to the president as a naive first and second grader who cared about the environment and had a strong position against the Iraq War, even then. I was debating conservative Christians online from the time when I was about 11 or 12, and I got decently good at operating on their level, which probably isn't saying very much. I dipped my first toe into Marxist views when I was 18 and have basically been sliding to the left in some sense since then. I am an abolitionist. I do not believe in the state or the nation or prisons or police or the family or a great many of the other institutions under but not necessarily uniquely problematic within modern capitalism. There is still much that I do not know, and in the process of positioning myself as a fellow learner, I have tried my best to mature and refine my views. I mentioned earlier that I would have found some of the criticisms we just looked at of the handling of Daisy Fitzroy, the Vox Populi, and the politics of Bioshock Infinite more sympathetic years ago, and that was true. I find them less so now for the same reason that I'm getting all autobiographical on you all, which is that my view of the political left from the inside of the political left has changed. Please try to understand. My values remain firm despite what I'm about to say. I do not reject the political left, and I especially do not reject communism as the movement towards abolition. What I reject is the view that there is ludonarrative dissonance in anything about the portrayal of the Vox Populi. In fact, I believe they contain ludonarrative verisimilitude. Over the years, I have watched as people around me on the political left occasionally fall prey to exactly Daisy Fitzroy's kind of thinking, whether discussing the Romanov children, Israeli settlers, the Haitian Revolution, or even racial groups privileged in relation to colonialism in general. People misrepresent a lot of those conflicts, so much so that I risk a lot even naming them as controversial examples in this instance. But I think it's worth a try because Daisy Fitzroy is a real person. I don't mean that literally, obviously she's a video game character, but when a left-winger points to Daisy Fitzroy and tells you that what you're looking at isn't an authentic portrayal of a real problem in revolutionary groups and ideologies, but rather a complete caricature made by people who don't know what they're talking about, they're lying to you or themselves. This is a real element of many of our movements offline and online, and it's a real problem. Do you remember what Daisy says? The founders are a weed that needs to be pulled out by the root. To her, either their existence is a part of the injustice, or their continued existence would be a continual threat. She grounds herself in a kind of brutal, self-imposed practicality. Remind you of anyone? Keep it to yourself, but think about it. I just think the writing for Daisy was mishandled. The turn comes too fast, too soon, with not enough prefiguring and hinting. One minute, Booker isn't too sure about her, the next minute he doesn't care, then he's helping her anyway, then he believes in her, then suddenly he's a skeptic again. We get a loading screen where he tells us that a Welsher is a Welsher, and then in a minute she has her revolution, and in another minute she and the Vox Populi are killing civilians. This just wasn't executed well. It's total whiplash. In real life, something like this would much more realistically happen in two ways, where if it was a matter of Daisy's leadership, then her rhetoric about the founders would prefigure the logic behind this genocide more clearly, which is something we could have gotten in-game through dialogue from Fitzroy that Booker could potentially hear plain as day in her public propaganda or in conversation with her. Or where, if it was a matter of rogue members of the Vox Populi, then it would be contained to specific incidents in a way that becomes apparent at some point. As things stand, we don't get enough of the Vox Populi to make their internal motivations feel really human, and we don't get enough of Daisy Fitzroy to connect the dots between an ideological stance against racial oppression and an ideological stance in favor of racial genocide, right up until seconds before her death. It's not that the outcome is total centrist bullshit. After all, who's our supposed centrist stand-in here? The Pinkerton who slaughtered Native American Indians at Wounded Knee, really? If anything, we play as a reactionary. But the line of reasoning doesn't keep up that strong verisimilitude. As a plot point, it feels like a beat from a worse, if defensible, game. It does make you wonder about the Daisy Fitzroys of the left. I think she's a sympathetic figure, otherwise a total victim of circumstance, who nevertheless fights back and fights back hard, and not exclusively for herself. You can tell that underneath what we actually got at the surface level is potential for a real character, someone who genuinely has problematic elements of an otherwise liberatory worldview. I've talked a few times about the Ibram X. Kendi book How to Be an Anti-Racist on this channel before, and it's hard to imagine a more fortuitous opportunity in video gaming for a citation of it than this. There's something he talks about in a personal anecdote where he tells the story of being a much younger man at his university and buying into some of the ideas of figures like Diop or Bradley or Welsing. He tells a true story from his time at university. Quote, "I began my public writing career on race with a column in FAMU's student newspaper, the FAMUN. On September 9, 2003, I wrote a piece counseling black people to stop hating whites for being themselves. Really, I was counseling myself. I certainly understand blacks who have been wrapped up in a tornado of hate because they could not escape the encircling winds of truth about the destructive hand of the white man. Wrapped in this tornado, I could not escape the fallacious idea that Europeans are simply a different breed of human, as I wrote, drawing on ideas in the ISIS papers. White people make up only 10% of the world's population, and they have recessive genes, therefore they're facing extinction. That's why they are trying to destroy my people, I concluded. Europeans are trying to survive, and I can't hate them for that." The piece circulated widely in Tallahassee, alarming white readers. Their threats hit close to home. My new roommates, Devin, Brandon, and Jean, half-jokingly urged me to watch my back from the Klan. FAMU's new president, Fred Gaines, called me into his office to scold me. I scolded him back, calling him Jeb's boy. The editor of the Tallahassee Democrat summoned me to his office too. I needed to complete this required internship to graduate with my journalism degree. I walked into his office in fear. It felt like walking into a termination, the termination of my future, and indeed, something would be terminated that day. It's a long anecdote, and I'd hate to belabor the point by spoiling it all here, but in the next chapter, after a few revelations, Kendi returns to that line again. Quote, "As the editor and I stared each other down, I had a heated conversation, and conversion, in my mind. Eventually, the silence broke, and the editor excused me from his office. I received an ultimatum before the end of the workday. Terminate my race column for the FAMUN, or be terminated from my internship at the Tallahassee Democrat. I terminated my column in absolute bitterness, feeling as if I had terminated a part of myself. And I did begin to terminate a part of myself, for the better. I began to silence one half of the war within me, the duel between anti-racism and assimilation that W.E.B. Du Bois gave voice to, and started embracing the struggle towards a single consciousness of anti-racism. I picked up a second major, African American Studies." Kendi's words throughout this book are simple and easy to connect with. I truly think this should be elementary reading for a lot of people out there, Americans especially. His many anecdotes are humanizing in a way that is necessary to anti-racism, because racism is dehumanizing, whether by virtue of angels or vice of devils. He outlines carefully the logic underlying racism, systemically and ideologically, into a single unity with form, encircling our society and its many problems. I carry his words, that hating white people becomes hating black people, and hating black people becomes hating white people, in my heart. Perhaps you can see the perverse implications of Daisy Fitzroy's words and actions, limited as they are. Kendi makes some similar observations about racism and anti-racism. For Fitzroy, Having positioned herself as a liberator of racial minorities against racist oppression, and having located racism even in the existence of all the bloodlines of the human beings that constitute the race of the founders, she has curiously reverse-engineered the beliefs of the most racist, genocidal white nationalist. For her, the existence of the founders and the racial groups they have oppressed are oppositional, which lends itself also to the belief that a founder would be fighting for their self-preservation and the preservation of their race if they were to ethnically cleanse the black people like Daisy in Colombia. This is, of course, white nationalist propaganda, not the game itself, but Daisy's own personal views as a character. However, because she considers those views in the inverse order, and because she has prima facie attached seemingly a moral quality to the freedom of the oppressed groups for whom she fights, she does not see this continuum of the logos of racism. The real Daisy Fitzroys don't see themselves that way either. They, perhaps at one time it would have been better to say we, only see ourselves as liberators, and therefore never as engaged in oppression. In times like these, I remember also the words of Paulo Freire in Pedagogy of the Oppressed, which I have also endeavored to share with you all. And in particular, I think of his mantra that it is the great irony of oppression, that the ability to thwart it comes precisely not from gaining or acquiring the power of the oppressor, but from emancipating oneself from it. That power and that use of power is anathema to liberation. Again, ironically, the powerlessness of the oppressed is a kind of source of their power. Developing these ideas in our movement, I think, is crucial. Perhaps a certain conscientization is necessary to engage further with a work like Bioshock Infinite in these spaces. A lot of us rejected the game's portrayal of Daisy Fitzroy, I think, because we saw something of ourselves in her, but I embrace her for that reason. She's real, and she's wrong. People will tell you that opposing the real Daisy Fitzroys of the world makes you complicit in the real Columbias of the world. But I think the truth is that these means will never produce justice. We can't square that circle, and it's frustrating, but there's a subtle truth in Daisy's words and way of thinking that we do get, despite wishing that we got more, which points to a false consciousness that is in reality a reaction to liberation, not an expression of it. After we make our agreement with Daisy, we have to fetch guns for the Vox Populi. We meet a gunsmith's wife who is Asian, and we go to rescue him, where he's been taken by Jeremiah Fink. We come too late, but Elizabeth can use her powers to open tears in reality as part of a kind of wish fulfillment, and so she takes us through to a reality where the gunsmith, Chen Lin, is still alive. Oddly, his wife is now a white founder, and it is his tools which are missing, so we go in search of those. The process is repeated when we find them, with Elizabeth opening a tear through to a world where we can find that the Vox Populi have their guns and have begun their revolution. And in the gunsmith's shop, Chen Lin and his white founder wife lie dead. This is real. Anti-miscegenation sentiment is a real problem among even real left-wingers. Remember what I said about Daisy Fitzroy's way of thinking, attaching morality and oppressiveness to the membership of and existence of different racial groups? This is where that line of thinking leads, and I can almost hear this story telling me, learn from this, try to understand, do something, or here is your revolution. I'd like to return to some of the themes of this story by using an anecdote of my own. I recently had an opportunity to speak with my grandfather, not my mother's father, the hippie Polish granddad who looks like Santa Claus and quotes Bertrand Russell, but the Catholic Christian Irish granddad who knows all the sailor songs. He got around to telling me one of his old refrains that he's been using on people since my aunts and uncles were kids, about the story of the workers in the vineyard. It's a parable from the Gospel of Matthew in the New Testament. Over the course of a day, a number of workers are sent to work in the vineyard, and though they arrive to begin working at different times, at the day's end they are all paid 1 denarius. When the workers complain, they are told that they agreed to 1 denarius and have received 1 denarius, and their employer has done as he wishes with what he owns and counts himself generous. This is taken as a parable for the kingdom of heaven, and it is said that those who are last will be first and vice versa, for many are called but few are chosen. In this context, it's hard not to see how the rhetoric of hard work within Christianity is what makes characters like Father Comstock and Jeremiah Fink such good bedfellows. The robber baron will gleefully profit from the injustices done to the poor, and the religious man will tell the poor that they are entering into the kingdom of heaven in this way. It's a sinister rhetorical move justifying their exploitation. But I said to my grandfather, didn't God give David stones for his sling, guiding him to strike Goliath? Is it not therefore sometimes the will of God that the weak should rise against the strong? And are we not told in the Beatitudes that it is the meek who are blessed, for they shall inherit the earth, and that those who hunger and thirst for righteousness are also blessed, and that such hunger and thirst will be sated? And is Christianity not in some sense founded on the belief that your God so loved the world that he would give his Son, the Lamb of God, to take away the sins of the world? Christ was man and divine in the story, and he changed the fate of mankind. In the story of Bioshock, Elizabeth is the Lamb, and Booker changes the fate of mankind. And perhaps most curiously of all, he does not do this through grand heroic sacrifice, but merely by ending his own evil on the world by letting his child kill him, by drowning him in baptism. In some way, he's the inversion of Christ. On his hand is branded the letters AD, for the Latin Anno Domini, meaning in the year of our Lord, signifying the birth of Christ. But the letters signifying his status as Comstock's false shepherd also stand for Elizabeth's real name from before Booker gave her away, Anna DeWitt. There is a circle here unifying the logic of Christianity, America, and white supremacy, as well as the logic of the lives of Booker and Elizabeth. In another sense, Booker is the white class-collaborating genocidaire viewing at a distance the classist white supremacy of Columbia, and his final answer is not to become its hero or throw his lot in with this side or that, but to become self-effacing. He chooses his own annihilation in response to all these injustices, and isn't that a curious thing? Perhaps he only does it because he loves his daughter, but in a way, he's an actualization of something real, and while it's not a perfect ending, there's at least something truthful about it. The circle remains unbroken. Comstock's end has to be Booker's end, and Booker's end has to come at Comstock's beginning. The circle remains unbroken. Its logos yields itself to a self-effacing return, and this notion is married to those same injustices, to racism and classism, to religious oppression and state oppression. Thank you for watching. I hope my words have managed to reach you. It's not often that I allow this sort of pessimist side of me to come out, except through my art, because I think in one sense it's my duty as a commentator to provide people with something that pushes them to deeper thinking, and for most people, pessimism just seems to shut them down, and because in another sense, I don't think people will understand my meanings if I communicate them just with words directly. Pessimism doesn't shut me down, it provokes me. It seems to deactivate most everyone else, so they reject it or become reactionary, but it has always had the opposite effect on me, so I embrace it as part of my progressivism. I am not bothered by pursuing what looks to be impossible. I am not bothered by walking into a world I cannot see. What the momentarily befuddled man calls a world of fear and darkness, the blind man calls living. There is wisdom in that, I think, even as an atheist. We seek understanding in a world that, if we are perfectly honest with ourselves, we know contains many subtleties that elude us and many potentialities that frighten us. And I am frightened of the dark. I understand the truth of Freire's words now, that the oppressed come to fear freedom. Once, in an essay about Avatar: The Last Airbender, I talked about faith in the context of politics, our values, and imagining the future. I know some people found that silly, and they weren't all shy about saying so, but the truth is that I have faith, not in God or anything supernatural, but something much more simple. I have faith in justice. I have faith in the end of oppression. I have faith in these things because I know that if a social structure has a unifying underlying logic, and if it was made by mankind, and if we can detect and judge its inputs and its outputs, then we can fight it and we can beat it. That faith is in logic. All these systems have shapes, and all these shapes yield to a self-effacing truth. There is a shape to the world even in the dark. There is a logic to oppression, and understanding brings light to the darkness. I am no longer frightened of freedom. The circle remains unbroken.